History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 6 The Great Acceleration. Chapter 2 Political Change in an Age of Revolution. Parties only came into existence when the Estates General had met. This is one reason why the day on which they did so, 5th May 1789, a week after George Washington's inauguration, is a date in world history because it opened an era in which to be for or against the revolution became the central political question in most continental countries and even tainted the very different politics of Great Britain and the United States. What happened in France was bound to matter elsewhere. At the simplest level, this was because she was the greatest European power. The Estates General would either paralyze her, as many foreign diplomats hoped, or liberate her from her difficulties to play again a forceful role. Beyond this, France was also the cultural leader of Europe. What her writers and politicians said and did was immediately accessible to people elsewhere because of the universality of the French language, and it was bound to be given respectful attention because people were used to looking to Paris for intellectual guidance. In the summer of 1789, the Estates General turned into a National Assembly claiming sovereignty, breaking with the assumption that it represented the great medieval divisions of society. The majority of its members claimed to represent all Frenchmen without distinction. It could take this revolutionary step because the turbulence of France frightened the government and those deputies to the assembly who opposed change. Rural revolt and Parisian riot alarmed ministers no longer sure that they could rely upon the army. This led first to the monarchy's abandonment of the privileged classes, and then its concession, unwillingly and uneasily, of many other things asked for by the politicians who led the new National Assembly. At the same time, these concessions created a fairly clear cut division between those who were for the revolution and those who were against it. In language to go around the world, they were soon called left and right because of the places in which they sat in the National Assembly. The main task which that body set itself was the writing of a constitution, but in the process it transformed the whole institutional structure of France. By 1791, when it dispersed, it had nationalized the lands of the church, abolished what it termed the feudal system, ended censorship, created a system of centralized representative government, obliterated the old provincial and local divisions, and replaced them with the departments under which Frenchmen still lived, instituted equality before the law, and separated the executive from the legislative power. These were only the most remarkable things done by one of the most remarkable parliamentary bodies of the world. Its failures tend to mask this huge achievement. They should not be allowed to do so. Broadly speaking, they removed the legal and institutional checks on the modernization of France. Popular sovereignty, administrative centralization, and individual legal equality were from this time poles towards which her institutional life always returned. Many Frenchmen did not like this at all. Some liked none of it. By 1791, the king had given clear evidence of his own misgivings. The goodwill which had supported him in the early revolution was gone, and he was suspected as an anti revolutionary. Some noblemen had already disliked enough of what was going on to immigrate. They were led by two of the king's brothers, which did not improve the outlook for royalty. But most important of all, many Frenchmen turned against the revolution when, because of papal policy, the National Assembly's settlement of church affairs was called in question. Much in it had appealed deeply to many Frenchmen, churchmen among them. But the Pope rejected it, and this raised the ultimate question of authority. French Catholics had to decide whether the authority of the Pope or that of the French Constitution was supreme for them. This created the most important division which came to embitter revolutionary politics. As 1792 began, the British Prime Minister expressed his confidence that 15 years of peace could reasonably be expected to lie ahead. In April, France went to war with Austria and was at war with Prussia soon afterwards. The issue was complicated, but many Frenchmen believed that foreign powers wished to intervene to bring the revolution to an end and put the clock back to 1788. By the summer, as things went badly and shortages and suspicion mounted at home, the king was discredited. A Parisian insurrection overthrew the monarchy and led to the summoning of a new assembly to draw up a new and, this time, republican constitution. This body, remembered as the Convention, was the center of French government until 1796. Through civil and foreign war, and economic and ideological crisis, it achieved the survival of the revolution. Most of its members were politically not much more advanced in their views than their predecessors. They believed in the individual and the sanctity of property. They prescribed the death penalty for anyone proposing a law to introduce agrarian communism, and that the poor are always with us, although they allowed some of them a small say in affairs by supporting direct universal adult male suffrage. What distinguished them from their predecessors was that they were willing to go rather further to meet emergencies than earlier French assemblies, especially when frightened by the possibility of defeat. They also sat in a capital city which was for a long time manipulated by more extreme politicians to push them into measures more radical than they really wanted and into using very democratic language. Consequently, they frightened Europe much more than their predecessors had done. Their symbolic break with the past came when the convention voted for the execution of the king in January 1793. The judicial murder of kings had hitherto been believed to be an English aberration. Now the English were as shocked as the rest of the Europe. They too now went to war with France because they feared the strategical and commercial result of France's success against the Austrians in the Netherlands. But the war looked more and more like an ideological struggle, and to win it, the French government appeared increasingly bloodthirsty at home. A new instrument for humane execution, the guillotine, a characteristic product of pre revolutionary enlightenment, combining as it did technical efficiency and benevolence in the swift, sure death it afforded its victims, became the symbol of terror. The name soon given to a period during which the convention strove by intimidation of its enemies at home to assure survival of the revolution. There was much that was misleading in this symbolism. Some of the terror was only rhetoric, the hot air of politicians trying to keep up their own spirits and frighten their opponents. In practice, it often reflected a jumble of patriotism, practical necessity, muddled idealism, self interest, and petty vengefulness, as old scores were settled in the name of the Republic. Many people died, of course, something over 35,000 perhaps, and many immigrated to avoid danger. Yet the guillotine killed only a minority of the victims, most of whom died in the provinces, often in conditions of civil war and sometimes with arms in their hands. In 18 months or so, the Frenchmen, whom contemporaries regarded as monsters, killed about as many of their countrymen as died in 10 days of street fighting and firing squads in Paris in 1871. To take a different but equally revealing measure, the numbers of those who died in this year and a half are roughly twice those of the British soldiers who died on the first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Such bloodshed drove divisions even deeper between Frenchmen, but their extent should not be exaggerated. All noblemen, perhaps, had lost something in the revolution, but only a minority of them found it necessary to immigrate. Probably the clergy suffered more, man for man, than the nobility, and many priests fled abroad. Yet fewer fled from France during the Revolution than from the American colonies after 1783. A much larger proportion of the Americans felt too intimidated or disgusted with their revolution to live in the United States after independence than the proportion of Frenchmen who could not live in France after the terror. The convention won victories and put down insurrection at home. By 1797, only Great Britain had not made peace with France. The terror had been left behind, and the Republic was ruled by something much more like a parliamentary regime under the Constitution, whose adoption closed the Convention era in 1796. The revolution was safer than ever, but it did not seem so. Abroad, the royalists strove to get allies with whom to return and also intrigued with malcontents inside France. The return of the old order was a prospect which few Frenchmen would welcome, though. On the other hand, there were those who argued that the logic of democracy should be pressed further, that there were still great divisions between rich and poor, which were as offensive as had been the old distinctions of legally privileged and unprivileged, and that the Parisian radicals should have a greater say in affairs. This was almost as alarming as fears of a restoration to those who had benefited from the revolution or simply wanted to avoid further bloodshed. Thus, pressed from right and left, the Directory, as the new regime was called, was in a way in a good position, though it made enemies who found the somewhat zigzag via media it followed unacceptable. In the end, it was destroyed from within when a group of politicians intrigued with soldiers to bring about a coup d'etat, which instituted a new regime in 1799. At that moment, 10 years after the meeting of the Estates General, it was at least clear to most observers that France had forever broken with the medieval past. In law, this happened very rapidly. Nearly all the great reforms underlying it were legislated, at least in principle, in 1789. The formal abolition of feudalism, legal privilege, and theocratic absolutism, and the organization of society on individualist and secular foundations were the heart of the principles of 1809, then distilled in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which prefaced the Constitution of 1791. Legal equality and the legal protection of individual rights, the separation of church and state, and religious toleration were their expressions. The derivation of authority from popular sovereignty acting through a unified National Assembly, before whose legislation no privilege of locality or group could stand, was the basis of the jurisprudence which underlay them. It showed both that it could ride out financial storms far worse than those the old monarch had failed to master, national bankruptcy and the collapse of the currency among them, and that it could carry out administrative change of which enlightened despotism had only dreamed. Other Europeans watched aghast, or at least amazed, as this powerful legislative engine was employed to overturn and rebuild institutions at every level of French life. Legislative sovereignty was a great instrument of reform, as the enlightened despots had known. Judicial torture came to an end, and so did titular nobility, judicial inequality, and the old corporate guilds of French workmen. Incipient trade unionisms was nipped in the bud by legislation forbidding association by workers or employers for collective economic ends. In retrospect, the signposts to market society seemed pretty plain. Even the old currency based on the units in the Carolingian ratios of 1 ratio 20 ratio 12 gave way to a decimal system of francs and centimes, just as the chaos of old fashioned weights and measures was, in theory, replaced by the metric system later to become almost universal. Such great changes were bound to be divisive, the more so because minds can change more slowly than laws. Peasants who eagerly welcomed the abolition of feudal dues were much less happy about the disappearance of the communal usages from which they benefited and which were also part of the feudal order. Such conservatism was especially hard to interpret in religious affairs, yet was very important. The holy vessel kept at Reims, from which the kings of France had been anointed since the Middle Ages, was publicly destroyed by the authorities during the Terror. An altar to reason replaced the Christian one in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and many priests underwent fierce personal persecution. Clearly, the France which did this was no longer Christian in the traditional sense, and the theocratic monarchy went unmourned by most people. Yet the treatment of the church aroused popular opposition to the revolution as nothing else had done. The cults of quasi divinities such as reason and the supreme being, which some revolutionaries promoted, were a flop, and many Frenchmen, and perhaps most French women, would happily welcome the official restoration of the Catholic Church to French life when it eventually came. By then, it had long been restored de facto in the parishes by the spontaneous actions of churchgoers. The divisions aroused by revolutionary change in France could no more be confined within its borders than could the principles of 89. These had at first commanded much admiration and not much explicit condemnation or distrust in other countries, though this soon changed, in particular when French governments began to export their principles by propaganda and war. Change in France rapidly generated debate about what should happen in other countries. Such debate was bound to reflect the terminology and circumstances in which it arose. In this way, France gave her politics to Europe, and this is the second great fact about the revolutionary decade. That is, when modern European politics began, and the terms right and left have been with us ever since. Liberals and conservatives, though it was to be a decade or so before those terms were used, came into political existence when French Revolution provided what appeared to be a touchstone or litmus paper for political standpoints. On one side were republicanism, a wide suffrage, individual rights, free speech, and free publication. On the other were order, discipline, and emphasis on duties rather than rights, the recognition of social function of hierarchy, and a wish to temper market forces by morality. Some Frenchmen had always believed that the French Revolution had universal significance. In the language of enlightened thought, they advocated the acceptance by other nations of the recipes they employed for the settlement of French problems. This was not entirely arrogant. Societies in pre industrial and traditional Europe, still had many features in common. All could learn something from France. In this way, the forces making for French influence were reinforced by conscious propaganda and missionary effort. This was another route by which events in France entered universal history. That the revolution was of universal, unprecedented significance was not an idea confined to its admirers and supporters. It also lay at the roots of European conservatism as a self conscious force. Well before 1789, it is true, many of the constituent elements of modern conservative thought were lying about in such phenomena as irritation over the reforming measures of enlightened despotism, clerical resentment of the prestige and effect of advanced ideas, and the emotional reaction from the fashionable and consciously rational, which lay at the heart of Romanticism. Such forces were especially prevalent in Germany, but it was in England that there appeared the first and, in many ways, the greatest statement of the conservative, anti revolutionary argument. This was the Reflections on the Revolution in France, published in 1790 by Edmund Burke, as might easily be inferred from his former role as defender of the rights of the American colonists. This book was far from a mindless defense of privilege. In it, a conservative stance shook itself clear of the legalistic defense of institutions and expressed itself in a theory of society as the creation of more than will and reason and the embodiment of morality. The revolution, by contrast, was condemned as the expression of the arrogance of the intellect, of arid rationalism, and of pride, deadliest of all sins. The new polarization which the revolution brought to Europe's politics promoted also the new idea of revolution itself, and that was to have great consequences. The old idea that a political revolution was merely a circumstantial break in an essential continuity was replaced by one which took it as a radical, comprehensive upheaval, leaving untouched no institution and limitless in principle, tending perhaps even to the subversion of such basic institutions as the family and property. According to whether people felt heartened or dismayed by this prospect, they sympathized with or deplored revolution, whatever it occurred as a manifestation of a universal phenomenon. In the 19th century, they came even to speak of the revolution as a universally, eternally present force. This idea was the extreme expression of an ideological form of politics, which is by no means yet dead. There are still those who, broadly speaking, feel that all insurrectionary and subversive movements should, in principle, be approved or condemned without regard to the particular circumstances of cases. This mythology has produced such misery. But first, Europe and then the world, which Europe transformed, have had to live with those who respond emotionally to it, just as earlier generations had to live with the follies of religious divisions. Its survival, unhappily, is testimony still of the impact of French Revolution. Many dates can be chosen as the beginning of the French Revolution. A specific date to end it would be meaningless. The year 1799, nonetheless, was an important punctuation mark in its course. Coup d'etat, which then swept the Directory away, brought to power a man who quickly inaugurated a dictatorship which was to last until 1814 and turned the European order upside down. This was Napoleon Bonaparte, formerly General of the Republic, now First Consul of the new regime, and soon to be the first Emperor of France. Like most of the leading figures of his age, he was still a young man when he came to power. He had already shown exceptional brilliance and ruthlessness as a soldier. His victories combined with a shrewd political sense and a readiness to act in an insubordinate manner to win him a glamorous reputation. In many ways, he was the greatest example of the 18th century type of the adventurer. In 1799, he had a great personal prestige and popularity. No one except the defeated politicians much regretted it when he shouldered them aside and assumed power. Immediately, he justified himself by defeating the Austrians, who had joined again in a war against France, and making a victorious peace for France, as he had done once already. This removed the threat to the revolution. No one doubted Bonaparte's own commitment to its principles. His consolidation of them was his most positive achievement. Although Napoleon, as he was called officially after 1804, when he proclaimed his empire, reinstituted monarchy in France, it was in no sense a restoration. Indeed, he took care so to affront the exiled Bourbon family that any reconciliation with it was inconceivable. He sought popular approval for the empire in a plebiscite and got it. This was a monarchy Frenchmen had voted for. It rested on popular sovereignty, that is, the revolution. It assumed the consolidation of the revolution which the consulate had already begun. All the great institutional reforms of 1790s were confirmed or at least left intact. There was no disturbance of the land sales which had followed the confiscation of church property, no resurrection of the old corporations, no questioning of the principle of equality before the law. Some measures were even taken further, notably when each department was given an administrative head, the prefect, who was in his powers something like one of the emergency emissaries of the terror. Such further centralization of the administrative structure would, of course, have been approved also by the enlightened despots. In the actual working of the government, it is true, the principles of the revolution were often infringed in practice, like all his predecessors in power since 1793. Napoleon controlled the press by a punitive censorship, locked up people without trial, and in general gave short shrift to the rights of man so far as civil liberties were concerned. Representative bodies existed under consulate and empire, but not much attention was paid to them. Yet it seems that this was what Frenchmen wanted, as they had wanted Napoleon's shrewd recognition of reality in, for instance, a concordat with the Pope, which reconciled Catholics to the regime by giving legal recognition to what had already happened to the Church in France. All in all, this amounted to a great consolidation of the revolution and one guaranteed at home by firm government and by military and diplomatic strength abroad. Both were eventually to be eroded by Napoleon's huge military efforts. These, for a time, gave France a dominance of Europe. Her armies fought their way to Moscow in the east and Portugal in the west, and garrisoned the Atlantic and northern coast from Corunna to Stettin. Nevertheless, the cost of this was too great. Even ruthless exploitation of occupied countries was not enough for France to sustain this hegemony indefinitely against the coalition of all the other European countries, which Napoleon's arrogant assertion of his power aroused. When he invaded Russia in 1812, and the greatest army he ever led crumbled into ruins amid the snows of the winter, he was doomed unless his armies should fall out with one another. This time they did not. Napoleon himself blamed the British, who had been at war with him and before him with the revolution, with only one short break since 1792. There is something in this. The Anglo French War was the last and most important round in the century of rivalry. as well as a war of constitutional monarchy against military dictatorship. It was the Royal Navy at Aboukir in 1798 and Trafalgar in 1805 which confined Napoleon to Europe. British money which financed the Allies when they were ready to come forward, and a British army in the Iberian Peninsula which kept alive there from 1809 onwards a front which drained French resources and gave hope to other Europeans.